everyone, welcome to The Higher Ground, presented by Wrazel Cannabis Broadcasting Network. I'm your host, Farah. Today, we have the honor of having a wonderful guest, Jessica Gonzalez. She is an intelligent and talented attorney in the cannabis space based out on the East Coast. So today, we're going to have a little chat. We're going to be talking about social equity. What is it? Why is it important? Why is it needed? Some of the pitfalls and benefits. So we'll dig into that today. Really looking forward to it. Before we get to the meat of it, we're going to take a quick break and hear from our sponsor.
Ojai Energetics has the most advanced water-soluble CBD on the market. Its fast-acting, most viable products are made without synthetics. Most users feel the benefits with proper dosage in under 30 seconds, not 30 minutes like a regular CBD-rich oil. Their products are created using organic ingredients and regenerative farming practices benefiting both people and the planet. Ojai Energetics provides CBD users with a dependable bridge to optimal living, promoting everyday health and well-being. To see their products, visit OhioEnergetics.com. And to learn more about their current investment opportunity, visit their profile in the Wrazel investment marketplace at Wrazel.com.
Thanks. Welcome back to The Higher Ground. Jessica, it's so great to have you on. Thank you for joining me today.
Yes, of course. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to dig into this topic, but I want to give you a little chance to introduce yourself and your background. You're constantly involved in a whole bunch of things, and I know always doing some exciting work. So feel free to give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm a cannabis and intellectual property attorney at Bressler, Amery Ross. So it's a law firm based in New Jersey. We have about 5 other offices in other states. I'm also outside general counsel for Minorities for Medical Marijuana. They're a national nonprofit with over 25 chapters in the U.S., helping people of color try to get into the industry via education, job fairs, resources, things of that nature. And I also sit on the state and federal policy committee for the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and most recently, I've been tapped on to help guide the campaign for legalization in New Jersey.
Wonderful. Keeping busy, I see. Always.
Of course.
Great. Well, I'm really happy to have you on today. You know, something that's been a hot topic in cannabis for a long time and really important, and especially recently been a topic of discussion, is social equity. So I wanted to give my audience a little bit of background, really get to what does that actually mean? And I think initially, why is it important? So historically, I know there's a lot of context and a lot of history about how Prohibition has disproportionately affected certain communities. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Right, yeah, sure. So a lot of folks who they're new to the cannabis space may not be aware of its intricacies and how it's related to race, and how you can't talk about cannabis without having race be at the center of it. And so back in the day, in the early 1900s, when there was a huge influx of more of the Mexican population, they brought over with them a lot of their culture, right? Part of that was cannabis. But prior to that, cannabis had been used for over 5,000 years in different folks' medical cabinets, right? But it was always labeled as its scientific name, cannabis. But when the Mexican population started to increase, and more popularity started to be gained amongst the Black population, right? Legislators needed to find a common denominator between both of them, right? And one of the common denominators was cannabis. So you couldn't criminalize anybody based on the color of their skin, but if you can find an element that was common between them, then you could, right? And so there were reports that came out that said, cannabis is good. There's no really pitfalls, no downfalls to it. They ignored reports of that nature. There's recordings of legislators back when they were enacting what's called the Marijuana Tax Act that was ultimately repealed. And then the Controlled Substance Act was created. But there's recordings of them saying, did we know that we were lying about cannabis? Yes, we did. And that it was really targeted towards Mexican, the Black community, and then in the 1970s, the hippie movement, the anti-war movement. So there's a lot of historical context to why cannabis was scheduled the way that it was. And truthfully, there was no scientific reason for it. It was just as a means to be able to criminalize a population that white America was afraid of.
Yeah, I'm sure for you as well. This is one of the reasons that I'm really passionate about working within the industry, and was frankly shocked to continue finding out the full nature of the history here. Even to hear that they have recordings of them admitting the intent and the effect of these policies were not accidental, can be quite upsetting. And I think that's why it's so important today.
Yeah, 100%. It was very intentional. And all of that propaganda that began in the 1930s and the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it did a really good job. It did exactly what it sought out to do, which was make this plant into a criminal substance, right? That was deemed as very dangerous and something that only criminals were using, despite the fact that it was a very well-known herb in pharmacology for thousands of years, around the world. And we're still seeing the effects of it now, right? Because for the criminalization of cannabis, really ultimately what it led to was huge incarceration rates amongst people of color, right? And so once you are incarcerated and you have a record, then it's very difficult to get into education. It's very difficult to, obtain loans. It's difficult to get into housing. It's difficult to get employment. So there's a lot of these generational effects that we are still seeing today, right? So the American Civil Liberties Union, they came out with a report in April of this year, actually, of 2020. And what they analyzed the cannabis disparity rate for the arrests in the US from 2008 to 2018. And one of the findings was that despite the fact that 37 states have implemented some sort of cannabis reform policies, the disparity in cannabis arrest rates between white people and Black people actually increased. It stayed the same for a couple years and it increased, right? And so that's kind of crazy when you think about the fact that more than half the country is either decriminalized entirely or just, has legalized medical or has gone adult use. And we're still seeing a lot of these arrests taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially to hear that this is happening to this day, right? We talk about prohibition starting in the 1930s and kind of the repeal of prohibition that's happening now across the country. And so many of these policies and restrictions and the way that, over-policing has played into all of it, we're still very much seeing those effects in current numbers, talking about arrests for 2008, 2018.
Yeah, 100%. MJ Biz, they did a survey, right, of ownership in the cannabis space. And from 2017, it was 81% of owners in cannabis were white, right? You had about 5% Latino and about 4% or less Black, right? But then when you look at the incarceration rates, it's the opposite, right? And so all of this has really been precluding the same people who shouldered the criminalization of cannabis, they are now precluded from entering this legal cannabis industry, right? And so that's why now there's a lot of talk, right, about like social equity and social justice and reparations and everything, and everybody, talks about it. But what does it actually mean, right? And so what it just means, in my opinion, to me, it means, providing folks the same resources to be able to access the opportunities that they want, right? But if you're looking at a population that really, really shouldered the heavy burden of criminalization of cannabis, and then now there's this legal market and they're precluded because of a record, right? It just doesn't particularly make sense. And so that's why it's really important that there are resources allocated to these communities so that they have the tools to enter the cannabis space, right? Like as a lawyer, it's very difficult to enter this space. It's hyper competitive, it's extremely expensive, it's highly regulated. And so with all of these costs and all of this, and given the federal and state dichotomy as well, it makes it that much more difficult, especially for people of color who either they may not have been incarcerated, but their parents have or their grandparents have. And once again, it's that generational effect that till this day is precluding that population.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important to figure out ways that we can address the long-term effects of the targeted prohibition and even out who has access to the profits, really, right? This industry, people talk about how much money cannabis is going to make in the United States or in the world over the next few years, and those projections are always, astronomical. And when we look at the numbers of people who are benefiting from that, and the people who have been able to really access those funds and those profits have been a very narrow group and have excluded people who have historically, as you said, carried the burden of prohibition. So I know that a lot of different states now, because, cannabis is a state-by-state regime, each state has approached it in their own way and is trying to figure out how to answer this question, right? What are kind of some of the different approaches that we've seen, or I know kind of generally East Coast versus West Coast, sometimes there's a dichotomy to be drawn about how they've been approaching this issue?
Yeah, sure. So social equity programs, one of the issues with it, right, has always been implementation. So the language looks really pretty on paper of what they want to do, what they aspire to do, right? But the implementation really isn't there. And number two, it hasn't been long enough to assess a lot of these programs, right? So some of these newer states that are coming to market and have, legalized recently have taken a lot from other states that have already legalized, right? So especially on the East Coast, we have the late mover advantage of being able to look over other states and say, okay, what are they doing? Did it work? Did it not? But it's really hard to see what is working when there hasn't been enough time to really assess the viability of a lot of these programs, right? But some programs, such as like Oakland was probably the poster child for a social equity program and what it should look like, right? They have a 1-to-1 ratio where, if one license gets awarded, then one must be awarded to a social equity applicant, and you have to meet the requirements of a social equity applicant, right? In Massachusetts, we see that for the first 2 years that delivery licenses are available, they can only be exclusively to social equity applicants, and nobody else will have access to those types of licenses. Illinois started a grant, they started some funds, they started as well. So other states are now looking to see how we can implement this even further, right? But one of the problems also is the constitutional aspect of it, right? Because if you have these kind of percentages based on race, you're really opening up now, a huge constitutional lawsuit as to, whether or not that's fair or not. So one thing though that really is missing from a lot of these is the educational component to it and the incubator component to it, right? Because in order to help people get into this industry, you need to provide them with the foundation to do so. And that includes education, it includes access to professionals, right? Like lawyers are expensive, accountants are expensive, technical assistance, how do you create a business plan as well? Access to investors, since you can't just go to a bank and get one. So that's kind of what I would like to see moving forward, right? Because right now what we've seen are just, yes, some have priority, but if we're looking at Massachusetts, it took almost 2 to 3 years for the first social equity applicant to actually open up its doors. And then COVID hit and they had to close them, right? So the implementation takes a long time when the infrastructure is not there. And so there's a really big room for improvement. And Illinois, that was supposed to be like the golden nugget of social equity, really messed it up and from the beginning, and people had really high hopes for it, and now they're trying to do their best with a lot of these loans and everything. But what I want to really get across is that if the infrastructure is not there from the beginning, if social equity is not at the epicenter of legalization, and if it's just an amendment or like an exhibit, so to speak, then it's not going to work, because you need the structure there. You need everything to revolve around this type of program, right? But that's not what we've seen, and we haven't seen that in any state thus far.
AeroBloom is a proprietary patent-pending aeroponic system that reliably achieves at least double the crop yield of hydroponic cultivation. AeroBloom also uses 40 to 90% less water than hydroponics or traditional farming practices, and produces a higher quality harvest with one additional crop cycle per year. At over 4 pounds of AAA quality trimmed flower per light and one additional harvest per year, AeroBloom is the highest producing, most efficient cultivation system in the cannabis industry. To learn more about AeroBloom, please visit their website at aerobloom.com. And to learn more about their current investment opportunity, please visit the Wrazel investment marketplace at wrazel.com.
I guess, as you mentioned, it's about a lot more than just handing over a license or awarding a license to an equity applicant, right? There's all of these other resources that they need access to actually be able to open their doors to begin with and then to operate. Even for those who are just in the industry on their own, I think anybody can be overwhelmed with the amount of legal issues in particular that they can run into from top to bottom, from seed to sale in this industry. And certainly, an equity applicant who has this amazing opportunity to access the industry but might not have a finance background or a business, background as an owner. And so the whole infrastructure, you're right. I think that the whole infrastructure needs to be there on the state level to assist in accessing all of those resources and making sure that they're going to be there, as opposed to just kind of handing over a license and then walking away, which is a recipe for failure, right? We're going to end up looking at these applicants and saying, well, the program didn't work.
Right, exactly. And that's the problem, right? Is that you can't give a whole bunch of money to people who don't know what to do with it, right? There needs to be some sort of guidepost, because even if folks who are experienced in any sort of regulated industry can understand and appreciate that cannabis is a completely different animal, right? You don't have any other substance where you have a, federal versus state type of dichotomy. That just doesn't exist anywhere else. And so even folks with that experience have a hard time and really need to lean on a lot of professionals who dedicate most of their time to cannabis, right? But then there's also the issue of what is a social equity applicant? How do you define what a social equity applicant is, right? And so states across the United States have different definitions of it. Some focus on incarceration rates, others focus on salary. A lot of states have tried to stay away from race because of the fact that can cause some issues. But that's also, an issue that, in Oakland as well, it's very prohibitive, because there's these kind of requirements for you that you have to fit into to become a social equity applicant. But we have to make sure that that they're equitable and that they address the specific population, but that they're also not so restrictive that they keep out that population that we want to help out in the first place, right? And so that's actually something that I'm grappling with looking at different social equity programs, is what is an appropriate definition of it. And I don't think that any state has gotten it right. And I think it's just going to be some time in order for us to really assess, like, are these working, and are we actually helping the people who really need it the most? And it's not a handout by any means. So I don't want anything to come off at that. It's more, they deserve this type of resources because they really took on that burden. And so it's the state's responsibility that if the state took an active role in participating in the criminalization of cannabis, then they should take a very active role in ensuring that those same populations receive the resources to apply for the same opportunities as anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. So I think on that topic, let's see, are there a few things we could talk about that are pitfalls for these applicants? A lot of people want to get involved, want to have access to applying for those programs. How do they even begin to start to assess whether they're eligible and go through that process?
Yeah, so probably the biggest hurdle is access to capital, right? Like I said earlier, can't go to a bank and say, hey, I want to open up a cannabis dispensary or a cultivation site and I need some money. That's just not going to work anywhere until federal prohibition is lifted. So what they need to now look for are outside investors, right? And typically, as reports and statistics state, a lot of these investments really do tend to go to white males. And so now you have to, even just to get the seed capital to apply, right? You're looking at the very least 250,000, right? Because you have to incorporate the application fees, incorporate your lawyer's fees, your consultant's fees, your writer's fees, an architect, your lease if you want, if you need site control. So there's a lot of money that goes into just the opportunity to apply. And this is not even money allocated towards, your build out and everything like that, but it's just to apply, right? So now you have to go to an investor and persuade them to really take a bet on you. And in such a risky environment, there's so much that goes into that, right? But a business plan, NDAs, pro formas from your accountants. So it's not only access to the financial capital, but also the human capital as well, right? And then within that, a lot of states do require some level of experience with cannabis. So how do you get experience with cannabis in a state that has yet to legalize? Like, what a catch-22. It's like when you graduate college and they're like, we want you to have 5 years of experience for this entry-level position. Like, you just don't have it. So you now have to partner up with out-of-state operators that want to come into your state, and because you can fulfill that residency requirement, they will partner up with you. But what does that eventually end up doing? It ends up putting the resident at a very disadvantaged position because they need that experience, right? So like specifically in New Jersey, in the last round of applications, experience was 100 points out of a 300-point application. So a third for experience, right? And so if you didn't have it, you were already starting out at a deficiency. And if there's states that are very new to legalization, they're going to want to make sure that their operators have experience doing this, right? Because they want a successful market. And so to get that, now you got to go to the out-of-state people. You got to give up equity. You have to pay for SOPs. You got to go through a whole lawyer and negotiate the whole process. And that's a very, very heavy lift, right? And so now you're talking about access to capital, access to human capital, access to experienced operators. And then probably the last thing is that a lot of times the timelines are very prohibitive as well. The requests for applications typically tend to drop very quickly without much notice. So unless you had a lobbyist or a lawyer who was really keeping their ear to the ground, you wouldn't know about these applications. But all of these folks, these multi-state operators and people who are, have access to pre-existing capital would. So there's so many various barriers in trying to enter this because people are like, well, it's not just like opening up a business, right? You can't just go somewhere and pick something up and decide that you want to open there, but it's so heavily regulated, especially on the East Coast, right? Where it started off as a very heavy over-regulated market. So all of these various barriers make it very difficult, especially for people of color to enter the industry, which makes it that much more necessary to provide the resources for them to do so. And one of my favorites are priority applications. I'm a huge fan of them because if you give them priority, then it allows them to really get the time to set up and really, it gives them a better chance of succeeding when you don't have all these experienced folks coming in here, first.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there's a lot of challenges, I think, across the board, both for the states and the legislators to figure out how to best approach this and really do justice to the people who need access to these programs. And I hope that, we'll continue to have increased resources for those applicants as well to be able to access these programs. So I really appreciate you becoming an expert on it and helping educate everyone because it's such an important issue.
Expert's a strong word, but thank you.
I mean, listen, in the cannabis industry, we're all there's so much to learn and things change over and over and over again, So those of us who can be experts are those that are just trying to constantly learn, right? And listen to what the newest thing that's going on is. And that is, that's quite a task in and of itself. So I definitely applaud you for staying educated about it. And I really appreciate you educating me and my viewers today. So thank you so much for being on, Jess. I really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for joining us here on The Higher Ground on the Wrazel Cannabis Broadcasting Network. Hope to catch you next time. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.